Hello everyone. Today I'm excited to welcome back Jyotishman, who's the host of the popular show India and Global Left. So Jyotishman, nice to see you again after 1 year. Welcome back.
Well, thanks for having me on. Good to see you again.
So I would like to start by talking about the India-China relationship. From the past 1 year, we have noticed a steady improvement in the bilateral relationship, and in recent months, Indian Defense Minister Rajnath Singh, Foreign Minister Jaishankar, National Security Advisor Mr. Ajit Doval have been visiting Beijing for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So, what factors do you attribute to this recent improvement in the bilateral relationship? Because India has resumed issuing visas to the Chinese tourists, and China has opened up for the Manasarovar Yatra as well.
Yes, I would say three things broadly that must have contributed to this change of attitude on the Indian side. First, I think is that the U.S. arbitrary tariffs have made it clear to the Indian side that the United States is not a reliable partner. And what happened with the escalation with Pakistan also made it clear to the Indian side that while Pakistan has a very reliable partner on its side, India doesn't have any reliable partner to rely upon when it comes to security matters. But on the economic front as well, as the Americans arm twist India, and it's a very difficult situation for India because Indian tariffs are actually higher given the lower productive agriculture sector in India, which justifies the tariffs, higher tariffs under WTO norms. The US administration is now trying to arm twist India into opening up Indian agriculture market to flood India with its cheaper agriculture commodities. There are other sectors as well, defense and energy, etc. But the agriculture is the most vulnerable. But in the larger scheme of things, I think Indians have realized that the US is not a reliable partner, and it is not fair to alienate the PRC, the People's Republic of China, in a bid to be friend and ally with the United States. And I think that must be a massive factor behind the change of hearts. I think the second thing that is equally important is the pressures coming from the business side. And this is something Nirmala Sitaraman, the finance minister, made it extremely clear. She said that a lot of sections are pressurizing. They are becoming restive to open up relationships with China. And this includes not just big businesses that use imports of parts from China for its assembly and then thereby export again, or the pharmaceutical industry that gets a lot of active pharmaceutical raw materials, ingredients, but also small businesses in the retail sectors that includes toys, plastic components, buckets, even electronics, cheaper electronics, etc., etc. There has been huge problems there. And then even on the investment side, given China has become such a massive export of capital, India did used to get a lot of investment in its growing startups, including startups like Zomato and Swiggy, etc. And so there is a huge amount of restiveness within the business class because of what has happened to the economic relationships. And I think finally, I'm not sure about this, but I think this might be also something driving behind this decision, given this acceleration of the normalization of relationship came right after a few months of the not so happy ceasefire for the Indian side. I think they have realized that going in the offensive on the military field is not a viable option. If it is not an option with Pakistan, it's definitely not an option with China. And so I think there must be some switch in the military strategy from offensive to the defensive. And when you make that switch, then it becomes all the more reasonable to have a much friendlier relationship with China. I would say these three factors must have driven the change of hearts, if you like.
So, given the huge economic relationship that exists between India and China, how do you think India and China can continue to build on this stability? Because the situation at the border still remains volatile. Although there's a sense of calm, each side still have a large amount of soldiers, and China sometimes provokes India on the maps, and India takes some countermeasures relating to Tibet as well. So this, all these things keep going on, and this all will ensure that the trust will still remain low. And we saw with the recent India-Pakistan conflict how India was a bit uneasy due to the Chinese support for Pakistan. So how do you think in the long term, let's say over the next 5 to 10 years, India and China can ensure that this stability continues? Do you think Trump's presidency will contribute to the automatic stabilization of these ties?
To some extent, yes, not automatic, but to some extent, as I said earlier, that to the extent that Indians have realized, Indian administration has realized now that the United States is not a reliable partner, whether it's economic or strategic. It is not a good idea to pick a fight with China in order to become an ally of the United States, if at all that was ever something on the card. I will argue that was never on the card. Um, how do we go about stabilizing and normalizing relationship with India and China? I think the most important factor here is the larger strategic alignment. The border issue, I think, is a component of that, or is a byproduct of that. I mean, by that I mean that how we go about resolving the border dispute is would be heavily contingent on how we restructure the larger strategic question in the Indo-Pacific, and also to some extent in the Himalayas that involves Pakistan. And by that I mean that India has to first convince the Chinese that we are not participating in the imperialist encirclement of China in the Indian Ocean, Indo-Pacific region. India should immediately abandon from AUKUS. It doesn't ensure India's security at all. I mean, Ukraine couldn't ensure its security by becoming by even by being such a close ally of the West. Taiwan, a lot of people in Taiwan are saying, more so in the KMT side, but with the recent failure in the recall, you see the DPP failed to secure a majority. It is very clear that a lot of people, a huge majority, maybe a majority of the people in Taiwan now thinks that escalating relationships with the PRC is not a good idea, given the United States would not come to help or save Taiwan in the event of an escalation. So increasingly, some countries are realizing that that's not a good idea. So I think the first thing that should be done on the Indian side is to ensure the Chinese that we are not participating in this big power politics, big power game, or that involves ultimately encirclement of China. When you do that, that has a bearing on the Pakistan side. And I think there has to be some restructuring of India-Pakistan relationship as well. I think it's a fairly reasonable assumption to make that Pakistan doesn't want to go to war with India. I think most people would agree with that, and that this was extremely evident even with that escalation. The mainstream media, the television media, Pakistani officials, podcasters, everyone on the streets were saying that we should stop this. We want a ceasefire. It was the Indian side that went in the offensive. So it is extremely clear that Pakistan is not going to pick up a fight with India, given the asymmetry between India and Pakistan on the economic side. Will there be some occasional terrorist attack that may or may not be linked to Pakistani soil? Perhaps. I mean, no one can guarantee. Even Pakistani establishment is not in full control over. What should the Indians do? Well, on the Indian side, strengthen your intelligence. And on the external side, involve multilateral platforms. Use the Financial Action Task Force, but even also use the Pakistani side to increase the stake that Pakistan won't be able to support these operations. If at all they are supporting, because there is a lot of evidence piling up on the other side that that's not the case anymore. So I think that once you normalize relationship with Pakistan to some extent, then the Chinese factor on the Western flank becomes much less volatile. Then you can come to the border issue. So I think the first problem, as I see, is the larger strategic realignment. Once you make sure that the Indian-China relationship would hinge not on, maybe there would be some competition, but maybe not on antagonism and security competition and war, etc. Then you can start with the border, resolving the border issue. And it's a long border, 3,800 kilometers or so. Not every part of that border is disputed. There are sectors which are heavily contested, and that there are areas, as you said, puts come under redrawing of maps and so on. I think there, once you have a better confidence, better cooperation, you can give and take there. The Indians have to accept that we can't have all our say, because ultimately this was a part of a history where empires existed, and as empires broke down, nation states made their own claims, and there were competing claims in certain regions. The best way to go about it is to make some exchanges. The eastern sector perhaps is not as strategic for the Chinese side as the western sector, so you can make some compromises there. I mean, those are more about the details in how you go about it, but I think you can do that. You can also, from an Indian side, enforce the clause that settled areas would not be disturbed. And this was something the Chinese were amenable to for a very long time. And that would mean that places like Arunachal Pradesh, even though Chinese would sometimes draw a map to irritate India when things are not going well, for all practical purpose, those areas would not be disturbed. And that would ensure the most important and most critical security for places like Arunachal Pradesh. It's not to pick a fight if you actually want to secure stability in these regions. So I would say the security component should be the first thing to build effective trust between the two nations. Once that is done, I think then there is an enormous potential that opens up on the economic front. I think the huge trade deficit that exists between India and China can be to some extent counterbalanced by inviting Chinese investments. And Chinese are willing to invest more and more, given, of course, the tariff situation on one hand, but also given that China is also trying to move away from the United States, disentangle from the United States, whether it's on the investment side, which included a lot of investment in the treasuries market, or whether it's on the trade side. So you can invite Chinese investments. Now, of course, there are questions about to what extent Chinese would be willing to share technology. Of course, it seems to me that at the moment they are reluctant to share technology, just as the Western companies are very reluctant to share technologies with Indians. But you can work on that as confidence improves. I'm sure there can be some technology transfer. There would be certain areas where some hard negotiations would have to be made. There can be the agriculture, we don't have to worry because China doesn't export. But industry, we will have to worry on certain level. There you can have some negotiated non-punitive tariffs on certain sectors while opening up other sectors. There is a huge potential to gain in certain sectors like AI, in certain sectors like automobiles, in electronics, where India needs a lot of components and technology. And finally, I would say one of the biggest areas of economic cooperation that I see would be infrastructure investment. As the property sector trouble within the Chinese economy becomes resistance, China would be increasingly looking forward to invest more and more in the infrastructure outside China, which is also part of its Belt and Road Initiative. India would be able to join the Belt and Road Initiative. Who else than India needs desperate funding in infrastructure? I mean, if there is ever a country, ever a place on earth that lacks infrastructure, it is India. I mean, part of the reason why India looks so poor, even poorer, I mean, part of the reason why India looks so poor is that it has never been able to tackle the problem of absolute poverty. So you see all the poor people thronging in the city. But part of the reason why India also looks poorer than it is reflected in the GDP figure is its very poor infrastructure. Roads, waste disposal, public transport, etc., etc. There is a huge potential, enormous potential, in terms of using Chinese know-hows and investments and skilled labor, etc., to improve that. So I would place these four broad pillars as something to be placed at the center of India-China relationship for the future. Just to repeat, the strategic component first, then the border, then economic cooperation in the sectors that you can, and finally massive cooperation on infrastructure, and to some extent I would also say on building skills. Agriculture is another area where China and India doesn't have a lot of conflict because they don't export into each other's territory, while China has a lot years and years of experience about how to increase uh, agriculture productivity. So you can start with those areas.
I wanted to discuss the economic side, but I think you broadly summed up what I wanted to ask. So my final question for this part would be on the BRICS. Do you think until last year, Indian media was reporting that BRICS and SEO was a place where China and India would at times compete against each other's interests. But now, with the threat of Trump, how do you see India and China converging on BRICS and platforms like organizations like the SEO?
Yes, I think it is in India's interest to not become the troubled piece within the BRICS. There's a lot of talk now about how India is actually frustrating the collective project of BRICS. And I don't think that is in India's interest. India should be able to build greater confidence and alignment with the larger collective interest of the BRICS. And that would include India's interest as well. I mean, think about what is going on in West Asia, for instance. I mean, if you look carefully at it, one of the areas to look at from India's perspective is the Zangezur corridor in Azerbaijan. And what we are seeing there is that the United States is trying to use its allies in the Persian Gulf, but also now increasingly in its attempt to use Syria and Lebanon and Turkey to come up with some sort of Abraham 2 accord, as an alternative trade, investment, and security arrangement to the BRICS. And we saw the tilt in Azerbaijan with the West there. Its territories were used while Israel launched its offensive in Iran. Its territories were also used in the spiderweb attack against Russia. So the US administration is trying to use the South Caucasus, particularly Azerbaijan, to increase its own influence. But what is India's stake in that? Well, India's stake, it turns out, to be in on the same line with that of China and Russia. Why? Because we have the Chabahar port, which wants to link up through Central Asia into Russia and so on. And so it's not in India's interest to let the Zangezur corridor to fall in the hands of Azerbaijan and then into the whole Abraham Accord League. It's rather more in India's interest to keep a multilateral arrangement in that region where Iran and India can come together along with Russia. Of course, once you normalize a relationship with China, there is a much larger alignment there. So this is just one example, but actually you can take many other examples. The disputes within WTO. I mean, for all practical purpose, the concerns of India and China are in alignment against the advanced industrial nations, because India and China are both charged of protecting its agriculture sector. So, under the fair trade dispute resolution mechanisms and all, India and China have been fighting same kind of battles within that. Building of reserves, de-dollarization. I mean, you can actually think of any other things. I think there is a lot for India to gain by aligning itself or committing itself fully to BRICS. Well, that doesn't mean that India cannot have good relationships with the West either. But you have to come out of that security strategy where you think that we will be part of that strategy of encircling China, and we would situate ourselves within that imperial Western bloc.
Remains to be seen what happens, and one hopes that India China relations continue to improve.